Congratulations on the purchase of your water filter and salt-free water softener. Your new system works in 3 stages. First, chemicals and contaminants such as chlorine are removed. The sediment filter will then eliminate any particulate. The FutureSoft softening tank will then neutralize any remaining hardness. This video will walk you through the installation process. The system will consist of the following parts: the carbon filter tank, which is listed as CF, the conditioner tank, labeled as FS, a housing for the sediment filter, a sediment filter, a spanner wrench, a mounting bracket, 4 MNPT fittings, a tank head for the carbon filter tank, a gasket and lube for the sediment filter housing, a hose bib assembly, and 2 bypass valves. Your system is compatible with PVC, copper, and PEX tubing. This installation video will feature a combination of PVC and corrugated water connectors. 48 hours prior to the installation, the media in the tanks will need to be activated. This will be accomplished by filling both tanks with water. The carbon filter tank is shipped without a head on it. It will need to be placed. The FutureSoft tank has the head pre-attached. Since the carbon filter tank needs the head installed, let's go ahead and begin by performing that step. Begin by unscrewing the cap that's on the top of the tank. It can be discarded as it is no longer required. Locate the tank head that comes shipped in a smaller box. There is an opening on the bottom of the tank head that will align with the pipe that's found inside of the tank. Align them and then press the tank head in place. Press down on the tank head while simultaneously threading it. Begin by hand tightening the head. Once the head is hand tightened, you will need to fully seat it in place. To give you leverage, you can insert the head of a screwdriver into one of the openings. To help hold the tank in place, you can place your feet around the boot at the bottom of the tank. With the right amount of leverage, you can now fully tighten the tank head onto the top of the tank. Please note that once a tank head has been screwed onto the tank, under no circumstance should you unscrew it or you will risk damaging your system. This may also cause the carbon media to seep into your plumbing. The provided bypass valve will now be installed. There are extenders with rubber fittings that will be pressed into the openings on the tank head. Thread the 2 connectors onto the head and fully tighten them to secure the bypass valve in position. You will now install the MNPT fittings. Insert the rubberized fitting into the opening on the bypass valve and then tighten it in place. Repeat this on the other side of the bypass. The hose bib adapter will now be required to soak the media inside the tank. Locate the inlet side on the carbon filter tank and then fully tighten the hose bib adapter to that connection. A garden hose that's connected to your spigot will then be connected to the hose bib adapter. Before turning on the water, ensure that the bypass is not activated. The valves on the top of the tank should be positioned as shown here. Turn on the water to the hose about halfway. Once water begins to exit the tank, the water can be turned off. Shut off the water to the hose. The valves on the tank head will now be set to bypass. The hose can now be disconnected. The FutureSoft tank will also need to be soaked. Begin by attaching the bypass valve, followed by installing the MNPT fittings. Repeat the same steps as a carbon filter tank to fill the tank with water. Once both tanks have been filled with water, remove the hose bib adapter and store it in a safe location. At this point, both tanks look the same, but you'll find a CF printed on the carbon filter tank and an FS printed on the FutureSoft tank. Store both tanks for 48 hours to allow the water to soak into the media. After the 48 hours has elapsed, the media inside both tanks will need to be flushed. Begin by installing the hose bib adapter and the hose to the inlet side of the carbon filter tank. Go ahead and turn off the bypass to the tank. You will also notice water escaping from the other valve. Turn on the water to the hose and allow it to run for a few minutes until it begins to run clear. After a few minutes, go ahead and shut off the water. Disconnect the hose and the hose bib adapter. Reconnect the hose bib adapter to the outflow side of the tank and then connect the garden hose. Turn on the water to the hose and allow it to run for a few minutes. The hose and the hose bib adapter can now be removed. Connect the hose bib adapter and the hose to the FutureSoft tank and repeat the steps to flush the media in that tank. The neoprene covers that came with your tanks can now be placed. There is a Velcro strap to hold it together to allow you to catch the zipper. Slide the cover downwards as you zip the zipper. The cover will be pulled over the boot at the bottom of the tank. Repeat this process with both tanks. With the other tanks prepped, you are now ready to prepare the sediment filter housing. Unscrew the top of the tank to remove it. Inside, you will find the gasket and the lube that's required for the next step. There is a groove indented along the top of the housing that will receive the gasket. Go ahead and lay the gasket in place. Apply some of the provided lubricant along the edge of the gasket, and then spread it out to ensure that it's evenly coated. The gasket will then be flipped over and reseated into the groove. Apply the remainder of the lubricant and once again spread it out to ensure that it's evenly coated. The provided sediment filter will now be installed. The opening of the sediment filter will sit on a nipple inside the sediment filter housing. Drop the sediment filter into the housing and then make sure that it sits flush. It should sit just below the surface. The lid of the housing has guides that will ensure that the sediment filter properly aligns when you put it back on. Go ahead and thread the lid and then fully tighten it onto the sediment filter housing. PVC nipples will now be installed on the in and the outlet on the top of the housing. To ensure that there are no leaks, plumber's tape will need to be applied to the threads on the PVC nipples before you install them. Thread the PVC nipple in place and fully tighten by hand as tight as possible. Repeat these steps on the opposite side. A pipe wrench or a pair of pliers will now be required to fully tighten the PVC nipples into the housing. The final step in prepping the sediment filter housing is to apply plumber's tape on the threads on the PVC nipples. The sediment filter will now be mounted using the provided bracket. Due to the weight, you will need to mount the bracket to a stud. And note that a level is beneficial during this step. Once you identify the optimal location, go ahead and mark out the holes to be pre-drilled. A 3/16 drill bit can then be used to pre-drill the holes for the mounting bracket. Locate the bag of the provided bolts and washers, and then use a 1/2 inch socket to secure the bracket to the wall. Before mounting the pre-filter to the bracket, take a look at the top to identify the inlet and outlet direction of the water to ensure that it's being properly oriented. It will then be secured to the bracket with 4 of the provided bolts. The next steps of this installation will have you tap into the pre-plumb. Please be sure to shut off the water to the home before performing these steps. Also note that it's a recommendation to install a bypass ahead of the system to allow for easy maintenance. Expose the pre-plumb and then install a connector with a 1-inch threaded adapter. You will need a threaded adapter on the other side of the pre-plumb as well. Plumber's tape will now be applied to the threads of the incoming water supply from the pre-plumb. A PVC shutoff valve is now being installed onto the threaded adapter on the incoming side of the pre-plumb. To avoid any leaks, ensure that the shutoff valve is fully tightened. Prep another PVC nipple with plumber's tape. It will then be installed onto the other side of the shutoff valve. Please ensure that the PVC nipple is fully tightened. A corrugated water connector will now be connected to the other side of the PVC nipple. And once again, please ensure that it's fully tightened. The carbon filter tank will now be introduced. Prep the tank by applying plumber's tape to both of the connections. The tank will now be positioned with the connections facing back. The corrugated water connector from the inflowing side from the pre-plumb will now be connected to the incoming side on the carbon filter tank. Tighten the connection by hand and then fully tighten to ensure there are no leaks. A corrugated water connector will now be connected to the outflow side of the carbon filter tank. Be sure to fully tighten the connection. That corrugated water connector will now be routed to the inflowing side of the sediment filter. Go ahead and thread the connection and then verify that it's fully tightened. The FutureSoft tank will now be introduced. Like before, prepare the connections on this tank using plumber's tape. The tank will then be positioned so the connections are facing back. A corrugated water connector will now be introduced into the outflow side of the sediment filter. Be sure that the connection is fully tightened. Bend that water connector to the inflow side on the FutureSoft tank. Connect to the inlet and then thread by hand. Then you will ensure that it's fully tightened. Connect a corrugated water connector to the outlet side of the FutureSoft tank and tighten by hand. Then verify that it's fully tightened. Plumber's tape will need to be applied to the threaded adapter on the other end of the pre-plumb. The corrugated connector from the FutureSoft tank will now be connected to the other end of the pre-plumb. Fully tighten by hand and then use a wrench to fully tighten it. At this point, the system is fully connected, but will now need to be tested. To do this, you will need to ensure that all the valves in the system are in the bypass position. If you install the shutoff valve, it will need to be in the off position. In addition, both of the tanks will need to be set to bypass. Another important task is to use a spanner wrench to fully tighten the sediment filter housing all the way. Finally, you will need to open the cold water on a bath or shower all the way. The water to the home can now be turned back on. With the water restored, you will need to inspect the shutoff valve to ensure that there are no leaks. If no leaks are detected, go ahead and open the shutoff valve to allow water to start flowing through all the connections. The water to the tub that you opened will also begin to flow. At this point, water is flowing through the sediment filter. Inspect the housing and the connections for any leaks. If you see water leaking from the sediment filter housing, the spanner wrench can be used to ensure that it's fully tightened. You will also want to check the connections on both of the tanks to ensure that there are no leaks. If no leaks are detected, go ahead and open the bypass to the carbon filter tank, allowing it to fill with water. As the pressure builds in the carbon filter tank, inspect the collar for any leaks. If any water is detected, there could be an issue with the O-ring. A solution for this will be discussed at the end of this video. The bypass valve on the FutureSoft tank will now be turned off. Your water will now begin to flow through that tank. Allow water to flow through your system for 10 minutes. And note that it's normal to see a small amount of sediment during this time. Once the 10 minutes have elapsed, the system is now ready to use. If you see water seeping from around the tank head on the carbon filter tank, it's an indication that the tank head is not tight enough or that the O-ring on the inside has become bunched. To solve the issue, you will need to loosen the tank head just enough to get a small gap between the tank head and the top of the tank. Do not loosen the head any further than this or you will run risk of damaging your system. That type of damage could also cause resin to exit the tank and into your plumbing. Once you have a small gap on the tank head, you can go ahead and re-tighten it into position. the tank can now be reconnected to the system. And you will then repeat the steps to verify that there are no leaks in the system. Thanks for watching, and congratulations on your new systems.